Hi everyone, and welcome to this guide for space combat in the Star Wars role-playing game by Fantasy Flight Games. I am going to be going over my take on space combat, and this is not a topic that I was super excited to go over, mainly because I find space combat a little complicated, and there's just a lot of like technical things in the book that I just don't really want to ever deal with as a GM. It's a little bit too much multitasking for me, but it was requested in another video to go over this, and I'm gonna kind of again give my input. What I'm not going to do in this video is go over too much of the technical aspects or the stats for ships, things like that, the weapons, what kind of components are. All that stuff is in the core book if you have it. If you don't, I will be putting the links for these resources that I have in the description, so you can take a look at those. So what I have is, this is the Age of Rebellion core book. We're in the Starships and Vehicles section. We have a Starship combat cheat sheet, which this has a list of maneuvers and actions for your players to do. Also, what you can use advantages and threats for, and then also there's kind of an example ship here, and then there's also a more extensive list of advantages and threats that you can use, and then this is just a vehicle sheet. So the main things that I want to go over here is how to include your entire party in space combat, because that can be one of the most difficult things to understand. Making sure everyone has a role, and kind of creating the picture. I do think space combat is something that relies heavily on narrative, and visualizing what's going on, because it can be hard, and I also find it difficult to use visuals for space combat. For instance, if I were to do a session in Roll20 online, what am I going to do as far as tokens and stuff? I can move things around, but it's not really going to do much. I think it's better to just describe it, have people imagine what it might look like, and go from there. So we'll start with just the basics of starships and what their stats are. So the main ones are silhouette, speed, handling, armor, hull trauma, system strain, and then defense. So silhouette is basically the size of your ship. It will affect when a ship is firing upon you, or when you are firing upon a ship, it'll affect the difficulty of that. So if you have a smaller ship, it'll be easier to hit a bigger ship, and then vice versa. Speed is pretty self-explanatory. This will really affect the pilot with their piloting checks and their ability to catch up on vehicles, or if they're slower, they might have someone catch up on them. The handling is also mainly focused on the pilot, so it is the number of blue dice that you will add to your piloting checks if you have a positive number, so +1, 2, and beyond. And then if you have a negative number, that is a slower ship, or a ship with less handling, and that will be the amount of black dice you add to your piloting checks. So those are the three main characteristics. The armor of your ship is basically soak. It works the same way as soak, so this is the amount of damage that you will soak as you are taking an attack. The hull trauma is the same as wounds. This is something that is important to note. You can repair hull trauma on your ship, but it's something that, let's say you have some really serious damage, there's a lot that needs to be fixed. Most of that should be done on a planet. You shouldn't be doing it in space. System strain works the same way as normal strain in regular combat. So this is going to be strain that you can use as a resource if you want to use extra strain in order to do something, or you can also replenish strain if you need to. So this is a little bit easier to kind of work around with. And then finally, the defense. These are numbers that will act the same way as defense for armor, and not every ship will have defense. And then also bigger ships will have these four areas that you can have defense on, and this will affect, let's say a smaller ship is attacking them, it'll affect, if they're attacking on one side, it'll affect the damage on just that side, and also the number of armor on each side will be affected if something is attacking that. So that's kind of the basic statistics for a ship, and that kind of leads me into, I guess, my number one rule in space combat is to make sure as a GM that all of the ships, you know what their components are, you know what their weapons are, and you understand what players can do with their ships. I think that's super important. If you have a rule book, and I'm just going to scroll way down here until I get to the list of ships. So so if you look at a ship, pretty much everything that you need is going to be here. So you'll be able to see the type of vehicle it is, who manufactures it, the hyperdrive, the Navi computer if it has one, the sensor range, and this is another component that you can use in combat. So you can have someone who's controlling the sensors, which can detect what a ship, what their components are, and what type of ship it is, that type of thing. What its encumbrance is, how many passengers it can have, and then also its weapons and everything like that. So understanding your weapons is super important. And this is going to be something that a lot of your other players, let's say you are the pilot or someone else is the pilot, being able to use the ship's weapons is something that other players are going to be doing a lot. So understand your ship, understand what it can do, and make sure your players know that as well, so that they're not either doing things they're not supposed to, or doing things, or not doing things that maybe they can do. So that's my number one rule going in, as I mentioned. And then number two is figuring out what roles your players can do, and that goes along with knowing the components. So if you have a player who isn't a pilot, isn't going to be good at co-piloting, you could have them focusing just on the deflector shields or something like that. You could have someone who's focusing just on repairs. I think a good setup is pilot, co-pilot, gunner, or gunner, and then kind of maybe a floater, mechanic, and in my opinion, any group that has more than 4 players is going to be harder to find roles for everyone. It can be done, but you're going to likely have players who don't have too much to do. I think 4 is kind of the magic number, unless for some reason you have a humongous ship and there's just a lot of things to do. And I think your role as a GM is to create that. You don't have to just stick with whatever's listed on, in this book. If you, let's say they're in a capital ship, or they're in a big cargo ship, you can, whittle down the components into even more specifics. You can, talk about certain gauges or meters that they can control, and it might have different effects on things. So, that's kind of the way I look at it, is putting as much detail as you can, into it, and making sure that your players are able to participate. And the participation goes into, I guess, my third point, which is, how do you describe a space combat? Well, the main thing to start off with is your range bands. So these are going to be different than the range bands in the planetary scale. As I just kind of move up, see if I can find it here. So here we go. So, the range bands. So it is different, as I mentioned. You will have ships who will only have weapons that fire certain ranges, just like any other weapon. A lot of the smaller ships will only have weapons that can do close and short range, while a lot of the bigger ships might have medium, long, or even extreme weapons. So close range is, obviously, it can be either a couple meters up to about 1 or 2 kilometers, something like that. Short range is going to be a little bit more than that, so it's several dozen kilometers away. Medium range is going to be anywhere from 50 to 100 kilometers, something like that. Long range is going to be about 100 to 200 kilometers, and then extreme range is anything over 200 kilometers. So if you think about it, on a space level, the extreme range actually isn't that much. It makes it hard to fire weapons, but if a ship is more than 200 kilometers away from it, you're going to be able to see it pretty well, even at extreme range. So at least that's how I play it. You can play it as it being way longer than that. Let's say you can only see something in the distance, depending on the size. Obviously, if you are looking for a TIE fighter, that's going to be a lot harder to see. But I think using the range bands is a good start if you're trying to figure out how to describe it. So, just looking back over here to our cheat sheet, and some of the maneuvers you can do. If you are, your pilot says that they want to move in closer, You can kind of describe, the the sound of the engines, and what they're seeing as they come up to whatever ship they're going towards. Um, I think that's a really fun way to do it. You can see certain components, um, and also if they're trying to fly away, have them describe in what fashion that they do it. If they're doing an evasive maneuver, what is that going to look like? Are they going to do some type of 180 spin? um, if they're accelerating or decelerating, describe maybe what the pilot is doing. Are they flicking some type of switch? Just trying to add as much detail as possible. And let's say they punch it, they try to go to max speed. You can say that the players kind of are thrown back in their seats as you slam the throttle, and the ship kind of fires forward, and you can feel the G force, kind of thing. And yeah, so staying on target is something that you can describe exactly maybe what they're looking for. So let's say they're specifically trying to take out a gun on a ship. You can say that you line it up, and then you're trying to get it, and then the vehicle might or the ship might slow down a little bit. So yeah, that's kind of the descriptions that I use. It's hard to do it when I'm not actually in the scenario, but just trying to build upon each of these things, each of these maneuvers and actions. Um, I think again the deflector shields is a really good one for players who aren't flying to take care of, for them to keep to monitor where other ships are. And that is something that you can, let's say you have someone else who's on the sensors, they those people can team up together and say, oh, there's a ship to our right. You can almost maybe have the crew see themselves as like a Star Trek, you know um, scene, like a scene from Star Trek, where you have people kind of talking all over each other, and there's like a lot of commotion, and like you check the deflector shields to the right side, and trying to get this language going here. It just makes it a lot more immersive that way. So this is why understanding your ship, understanding the components is so important, because you can't have those conversations without people knowing that. So again, another reason why space combat is not my favorite, because it can be hard to come up with language like that on the fly. I think it takes a lot of practice. So that is kind of my input on it. It's you can also, if you're slicing an enemy systems, it might be good to describe what they're what that the effect of that is, what's happening to the other ship because of it. And you can also feel free to go super extreme with it if there might be a collision happening, and you can kind of describe what happens with explosions and things like that. So really, space combat is something you have to work with in the moment. And I think also using your advantages and triumphs is another good way to just add on to it. But you don't have to follow these outlines for it. If you want to use a triumph in order to say that you destroy a ship or something, that's great, and you can explain, maybe a TIE fighter explodes, and then the shrapnel of it kind of hits the windshield of another ship, damaging it, and um, you can just go so many different ways with it. But I think describing where everything is in space, using distances is another thing so that I like to use. So it goes back to the range bands. You say, all right, so you're trying to attack this Star Destroyer, and to your starboard there is a TIE fighter about 20 kilometers away, and they're gaining on you. This other TIE fighter, you see a group of TIE fighters come out from under the Star Destroyer, and they're starting to zip by you. So just describing where everything is in space is important, but it's tough. It is very tough, because it's not only like what's in front of you, what's behind you, and left to the right. You'll also have to think what's above you, what's below you, what is the viewpoint of the ship that you're in. What are you looking at? If maybe you're upside down and you're looking at something the opposite way. It's going to make things tough. So Hopefully that gives some insight into how you might want to manage space combat. And I think the final thing that might be good to go over, I don't think I have, um, no, I don't really have it, but take a look at your character sheets and see what type of roles they can try to do. You know, if they're on the ship, and you might make your pilot do a bunch of cool checks. Um, so yeah, we're gonna look at this character sheet just to get an idea of some of the skills you might be able to use. So obviously, gunnery is going to be one that you're going to use a lot. Piloting is going to be huge. Astrogation, you can also do a lot as well. I think cool is a really good one to have your pilot do, especially if they are in a particularly hairy situation. Let's say they're in an asteroid field, they're trying to avoid, asteroids that are coming. Cool is going to be super important for that. Um, Discipline might also be good if, let's say, your ship gets damaged and it's pretty severe, and let's say there's maybe some alarms going off in your ship, something like that. Maybe your players have to roll for discipline because it's a very scary situation. Leadership is another good one, I think, especially if your pilot might want to be making some leadership checks if they're trying to calm their crew down. So I think this goes back to having the language and thinking about maybe a Star Trek situation. Encourage your players to scream and shout at each other during space combat. Encourage them to point out specific things in what they're seeing, because again, it can be hard to paint a picture if you're just saying you fly faster, you slow down, you make a right, you turn left. Like, it's not going to be fun, so you need to encourage that. And so that might mean, as a GM, you're creating lots of energy. What are you point out a player and you say, what are you doing? What is your role right now? The ship has just been hit on its starboard side. What is your role going to be? What are you going to do about it? And then this player, what are you doing? So just encouraging them to be involved in it. Mechanics checks, you're probably going to do if you're trying to repair. And I've never gotten to the point where a ship has been in really dire situations, but I would imagine that'd be super fun for your players to experience, and just to kind of see how they deal with it, with some severe damage onto their ship. So I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to go over. I don't have any specific examples for you, but yeah, the main things are: make sure you have roles for all of your players. Make sure you give them options for what they can do, especially if they're not a pilot. That's number one. Number two, understand all the ships if you're the GM, and make sure your players understand their ships. That's, I think, really important. Number three, in order to create a strong description and have your players visualize what's going on, first off, understand the range bands and kind of what that means as far as maneuvers and actions that are being taken place. And also, if you're trying to bring life to the combat, it is up to you to facilitate the characters and to bring them into the situation. And I think, again, my example of the Star Trek, situation, having them all doing different things, they're communicating with each other, that is going to be the most successful and fun type of space combat. And then finally, I guess, one of the final points is look at the character sheet, see what type of skills they can roll for, and then, incorporate those somehow. So, and even let's say there is a player who literally cannot do anything, have them do some discipline checks, have them do some cool checks, have them involved in some kind. Maybe they're in the back and they're making food, just have them involved somehow. So that's going to be it for me, guys. Like I said, not too technical, but hopefully that's given you, a little bit of help if you're having trouble with space combat. I still don't do it very often. I think I've only done a couple. So, yeah, not my favorite, but I know you guys probably want to know more about it. So I encourage you all to check out these resources, spend some time, just understand what you can and cannot do, but don't think about it too much, because then you're going to find yourself in the combat and struggling. You're going to be trying to multitask, trying to get every little thing right, and it's just not going to work. So focus on the story, and you'll be all right. So thank you all so much for joining me, and we will see you soon.